Excellent. Okay. So today I want to talk about the DSI issue, which has been covered a bit today, which is really good. So whether digital sequence information should be covered by the same sorts of access and benefit sharing rules and regulations as the physical resources. And this chapter sort of picks up on a lot of the same themes as Marcel and Abby's chapter. That what we call open science isn't always that open. And I think there's also some thematic connections with like Titileo and Danielle's chapter, and certainly with Christine and Elsa's chapters. So hopefully in the rewrite of this, I'll be able to weave some of that in there. So there's more explicit connections. So I wanted to discuss this by way of comparison with a book that was written in 1996 by James Boyle. He's an intellectual property scholar at Duke Law School. And the book's called Shamans, Software and Spleens, Law and the Construction of Information and Society. And I think Boyle draws out some points that are useful to consider in the current DSI debate about how in the global north, and I'm counting myself as in this group, we tend to think about information through the lens of the romantic vision of authorship. And so we see our IP system is designed on this as well. And because of that, we sort of devalue other sources of information when we don't think that it's the result of an individual artist or an author or a scientist. So the part of the book that I want to focus on is spleens, the spleens bit, specifically this guy's spleen. And this is John Moore. He, in 1976, was treated for hairy cell leukemia. So that's what the picture is there. In the pink stained red blood cells are those small pink ones, and then you've got the big white blood cells or the leukocytes, and they've got that typical hairy morphology that you see in hairy cell leukemia. And so in 76, his physician, Dr. David Gold, I think it was treating him for this and recommended that he have his spleen removed. They did that, and then they took the spleen to the University of California Research Center and isolated some of the cells from this guy's spleen and created a cell culture called Mo, after his last name, Moore, the first two letters. So that was a cell line that had significant scientific and commercial value because the cells produced two key immune system proteins in abundance, so really useful. Moore didn't know about this until 1983, and he filed, sorry, I live on a train line, so that'll happen every 6 minutes because it's peak hour. So he didn't find out about it until 1983. He filed suit against the university's board of directors and also his physician. And it was essentially for theft of his cells. So this case is taught in a lot of IP classes around the world, and the people familiar with it will know that I'm leaving out a lot of detail. But what we can interpret Moore's case as for our purposes is that he's either asking to commodify his own body parts or that he's the victim of theft of his most private information. And that's a quote in the book, in the chapter, sorry. So the trial court dismissed the case outright. The appeals court said that Moore did have general property rights in his body. And the California Supreme Court, which is this case that we're talking about, they reversed that decision and said that Moore did not own his own body cells once they were surgically removed. So, sorry, that Moore, did I say Boyle? Moore didn't own his body cells. Boyle, the author of the book that I was talking about, he analyzes the majority opinion of the California Supreme Court in a lot of detail, and I highly recommend the book. Actually, it was one of the two books that I read last year that changed the way I see things. And at its core, he frames this as being about questions of who can control information. The court essentially said that to give Moore property rights in his own body or his genetic information would threaten scientific research and innovation. On the other hand, they said that we have to give scientists property rights because it increases scientific research and innovation. So Boyle's just really asking, how does the court know which property rights will threaten innovation and which ones will encourage it? So the Boyle analysis to me sounds a lot like some of the arguments I've heard against including DSI within the international ABS regime. And for a lot of the paragraphs in this book, I felt you could change, a couple of words and it would still make a lot of sentence for the DSI debate. So for this one, we've got property rights or sovereign rights given to those whose territories can be mined for valuable genetic information will hamstring research because property or sovereign authority is inimical to the free exchange of information. Yet property rights must be given to those who do the mining because property is an essential incentive to research. How can we tell whether property or sovereign rights will have the effect of stopping the flow of information and when they will be necessary to start that flow? So one of the really interesting aspects of this analysis from my point of view was that Boyle was always talking about genetic information in this chapter. So for him, the physical and the informational were one and the same. And this was in like 1996. There's a brick phone on the cover of that book, and we're still having this debate about whether the information is the resource. I don't want to see DSI incorporated in the traditional ABS transaction that the Nagoya Protocol and the CBD default to. I think ABS has turned out to be a very ineffective way to deliver on the objectives of the CBD. And I don't actually think that adding DSI to the mix is going to do that much more in the way of generating benefits. So the purpose of the chapter isn't necessarily to suggest that we should include DSI in access and benefit sharing, or even that we shouldn't. It was more just to sort of challenge my own assumptions. I started as a bench scientist and I was a true believer in open access. And I think that was because I hadn't actually thought that much about open access. And I think Marcel and Abby's chapter does a really good job of examining precisely what open access means. And it doesn't mean that there are no impediments to access altogether. So I'm just trying to highlight, perhaps more to my past self than anyone else, that we in the global north are prepared to tolerate some impediments to accessing genetic information when it suits our interests, but that we're not prepared to do so when it suits the interests of the global south. And perhaps it's worth taking that recognition into these DSI discussions. And actually, I think that some scientists are really starting to do that with the recommendations for maintaining open access of DSI. They're making a real effort to incorporate that benefit sharing aspect of things. So Amber's talk today was a perfect example of that. The Wild Z report is another one. They've got fantastic open access recommendations that still include benefit sharing. And I think scientists are really, instead of pushing against the access and benefit sharing concept, they're really starting to incorporate these ideas of benefit sharing within the way they do things. So that's that.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, for the thoughtful chapter and presentation, and any chance to throw in the word spleen. I know that you would go for it. Oh, Abby's got a question there.
Yeah, really just I thought that was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed reading the paper. I really enjoyed reading Boyle's book. And when I read your paper, I'm inspired to go and read it again. So thank you for that. I absolutely agree with all the points you raise. And I think the quotes that you showed and that you updated, the whole challenge is about, what is I came out, some of you know, as an intellectual property lawyer, but it's supposed to encourage innovation. Well, it does, and who said it does? You can have evidence to prove anything. And I think when Marcel and I do our piece, I kind of started off, no, we can just get rid of it. We need proper open access. And Marcel almost drew me back into the middle somewhere. So I think this is just such a valuable lens to be reminded of, and new weapons if we want to categorize in that way in the argument. So thank you.
Thanks to James Boyle. If you know him, say good day for me.
No, I don't. I wish I did.
Thanks, Abby. Margaret has a comment in the chat. Do you want to talk to that, Margaret?
Sure. I'm just heavily deep in reading psychogeography at the moment for another project, and it just reminded me when you were talking about the global north. It just sounds very narcissistic to me, in that it's still based on a very deep-seated self-interest. And I'm not saying that we need to go down that path in terms of thinking about what's happening in the ABS regime, but I do wonder if there's some stuff that can be brought in from the psychogeography literature around affect and emotions, because, you know, for Indigenous people, we're often talking about, you know, the relationships that we have to plants, and it's not something that's physically separate from us. We have emotional responses when we start thinking about our totems or our ancestors being used in particular contexts. And so there is this whole emotional responses going on, and it's kind of glossed over with this big intellectual conversation. And I don't know if it will actually help the conversation, but I feel like there's some emotional geography or psychogeography going on here, which may help particularly Indigenous people.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. I actually haven't heard anything about, I don't know that I've even heard the term psychogeography before. So thank you so much for opening my eyes to that. I'll jump in and read some literature and learn about it. Thank you.
It's not all good.
Oh, okay.
No, some of the older stuff is based on people walking around London and Paris. So like the newer stuff is getting better, and there's a book coming out next year, which I'm hoping, it's written by a psychologist engaging with geography. So
Okay.
not a geographer engaging with psychology. So I think it might be a bit better, the newer stuff.
If you think of the name, please feel free to email to me, because I would love to read it.
Sure, I'll send it on.
Yeah, thank you.
Likewise, sounds fascinating.
Yeah.
Amber, you've got a question?
Yeah, I have to say I'm left like breathless or like on the edge of my seat. Michelle, thank you for that. But I wanted to know, like, how does the story end? So Boyle wrote this book in, I think you said 1996. So we should have, 15 years more of data. And so the courts basically said, okay, sorry, Mo or more, you're screwed. It's not yours. We have to give scientists their freedoms to do what they want, but yet of course they can claim rights on it. So are there any more decisions that can be instructive? I think it's an incredible parallel that you're drawing. Does anything happen over, like within, for example, the American system where this court took place? Do the precedents continue, or do the courts continue to uphold this precedent? And who does make money? I mean, is it the biotechnology companies that make money and they have the sort of precedent of being able to take advantage of patient stuff? And I do remember, and I just can't remember because I know more recently than that book is certainly there's a book on Gila, on Henrietta Lacks and her cervical cancer cells,
Rebecca
and the fact
Skloot?
that she also, what's that?
Rebecca Skloot?
Yeah, her
The Mortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Yeah.
Exactly. And then I think it is something like there is a sense, but this is super dark in the back of my head because I've never tied it to DSI, that actually she was supposed to have, or that this is where informed consent starts to grow, it starts to change. There is a recognition, and I'm not pressuring you necessarily to do that, but like, is the state of affairs, is the status quo the same as it was in 1996, or can patients get something? And I know that in the right now that we've looked into blockchain, for example, in the case of DSI, and the one place where there are pilot projects happening is that patient SNP data, single nucleotide polymorphism data, can be put into a blockchain. This isn't possible for full-length sequences. That's a side segue, but where patients basically can be paid for their unique SNP profiles and be compensated by large data mining companies for putting that data in there. So the question is, what's changed in 15 years, basically?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the Gila example. So I think that book was written in 2012 by Rebecca Skloot. And since then, Henrietta Lacks's family, so her grandkids, I think, have had an agreement with Johns Hopkins University to talk about whether they can provide prior informed consent for the release of any of their genetic information. So it's still evolving, I think. It hasn't stayed static since Boyle wrote his book. And there are a whole bunch of other cases that sort of, I think because of Boyle being heard in, and please any of the lawyers jump in if I'm digging myself a hole here, but because of the case was heard in the Supreme Court of California, I think it's only precedent in California, is that? Charles, I'm looking at you. I'm dying here.
It's been adopted pretty well all around the world, and there's a conflict here between the interests of doctors and the interests of the broader community. So even place I can speak for Australia is that we have exactly the same rule applies to Australia. You go to the doctor and give a blood sample. As soon as the blood leaves your body, it's owned by the pathology laboratory or the doctor. You know, most of us had, you know, heel pricks when we were kids. All that's owned by a private corporation now.
So this kind of connects with the poop question before, Amber, the microbiome. So that means those Indigenous and local peoples and local communities don't own that poop. It's whoever, is that right? Abby's nodding. Let's talk more about food.
The person who collects it is the owner. As soon as it leaves your body, it ceases to be you. It becomes this, you know, separate resource.
Even though it's got your own personal cells in it.
Yeah, and really trying to find some sources. I'll drop them in if I can. I did a lot of work on prosthetics and your body, and you get a prosthetic leg. Do you own that? Do you not? And a lot of the arguments there are about, yeah, you don't own your body, which on one view can be seen as a positive thing, but I think the discussion we're exploring today can be seen as also very much not. Sorry to interrupt.
No, thanks for jumping in. That's great.
One last question, because we have to stick to the time.
I think Elsa was next.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you, Michelle, for this exciting chapter. We definitely need to coordinate among ourselves all these people working on DSI. Again, I mean, I wanted to ask, and going back to what Margaret said on the psychogeography, I also, it's first time I hear about it, and I think it's very interesting, because I was thinking on the open science, which is not really open science for everybody, and which is being promoted, as you know. I mean, we have to keep this because all these people are doing this for the good of humanity, and maybe it would be worth it, some ethnographic or psychogeographic, or I don't know what kind of work it would be, to actually interview scientists and to find their, like, let's say, personal motives, why they are doing what they are doing. Because I mean, I'm quite sure that most of us, at least in the global north, are doing it for very petty reasons, such as, you know, money and funding and patents and publications and stuff like that. And yes, of course, like, the good of humanity is somewhere in the background, but maybe we need to let's say, unravel, like, why scientists are really doing what they are doing, and like, to also, like, put it out there in the debate, because right now it seems like developing countries are very, very egoistically, let's say, protecting their sovereignty, while, you know, scientists in the global north are working for the good of humanity. Of course, I'm putting in the very simplistic terms, but yes.
No, that would be really interesting to look at. I started as a scientist, and I definitely got into it for the money. It was all about wads and wads of cash. But also knowing that I was helping humanity was a plus, but it was for cash mostly.
Quick question, Margaret, and then we have to move on.
Sorry, just Elsa, in response to that, I've got 2 master's students with Daniel Robinson who are doing that at the moment. One specifically is looking at what motivates people to implement ABS regimes. And I think the motivation goes beyond that. It goes to a philosophical level around what philosophical principles are guiding people. And I think that's an important part of the debate that needs to be included. Yeah.